Good morning all, and thank you for taking the time to join this webinar. This morning, we will be reflecting on the New Zealand water sector, highlighting the opportunities, challenges and comparisons with the UK water sector. Water New Zealand is a national, not-for-profit organisation which promotes the sustainable management and development of the water environment, with a particular focus on drinking water, wastewater and stormwater. We are joined by Jo Parker, independent consultant who has recently spent 3 months in New Zealand on behalf of WRC. Jo is a chartered civil engineer with almost 50 years experience in the water industry, holding roles up to director level, with also global experience working in countries such as Afghanistan and Australia. In 1994, Jo was awarded an MBE by the Queen for her dedication and services to the water industry. We are also joined by guest speaker, Gillian Blythe, Chief Executive Officer for Water New Zealand. Gillian joined Water New Zealand in July 2020, and during this time, she and the team have increased membership numbers by more than 50% and are seen as the trusted industry voice on water matters in New Zealand. Gillian is on the advisory board for the Building Innovation Partnership and is an independent director of Electricity Networks Etora. Prior to joining Water New Zealand, Gillian held head of strategy and regulatory affairs roles at NZX-listed Meridian Energy, New Zealand's largest generator retailer, generating electricity 100% from renewable sources. If anybody has any questions throughout, please pop them into the chat box for us to raise them in the Q&A session at the end. Thank you, and I'll pass over to Jo Parker now.
Hi. Just out of interest, can people see the slides? Because I can't, which is a bit strange. They disappeared.
Yes.
I can at this side, Jo.
Oh, God knows what's
If everybody could just put a thumbs up if they can see the slides. Yeah.
Oh, well, I'll just have to imagine them that they're there. And thankfully, someone else is operating them. So. Great. Well, I'll get stuck in anyway. And if we move to the next slide, and I'll explain about my trip, which I was working for WRC, and I was going to be looking at opportunities for consultancy work in New Zealand, raise the profile of WRC, and possibly look for someone permanent out there. And I spent 3 months, and I actually arrived in New Zealand on the 11th of September, so it's just a year since I went out, so very topical. And I was based in Auckland with a company called Project Max, and the photos are the Project Max offices, which you can see are very modern, very zappy, and the view from the window. Now, how good is that? Fabulous view. Project Max are an asset management company specializing in network assets, and particularly taking inspection results, managing inspections, and then using those to develop renewal programs. So if I now talk a bit about New Zealand, because everyone knows about New Zealand, but I don't know how much detail they know. So next slide. And New Zealand is a little bit larger than Great Britain. It's sort of long and thin, and so that means no one's that far from the sea. But it's got a tenth excuse me, a tenth of the population. Can you imagine this country with just a tenth of the population? Fantastic. And a quarter of those people actually live in Auckland. So there's a big concentration in Auckland, which is in North Island. And so the rest of the island, there's an awful lot of empty space, agricultural land generally, and some sort of lovely sort of wilderness land, mountains, that sort of thing. The climate is quite similar to the UK, and I don't know what weather people are having elsewhere in the UK, but where I am, it was quite typical for weather in New Zealand as well. But unlike this country, it is subject sometimes to tropical cyclones. So that's not so good. If we go to the next slide, one of the other issues that people have to cope with in New Zealand, relevant to the water industry, it's on what's called the Pacific Ring of Fire, which means that earthquakes are a real threat. Wellington has the largest amount of earthquakes, I think, in the world. They have a huge number of earthquakes. It's a regular occurrence. And then I'm sure a lot of people heard about the Christchurch earthquake in 2011, which was very serious, and which I heard quite a lot about because a guy who had been a direct report for me had gone out to work in Christchurch, and as soon as I heard about the earthquake, I contacted him to make sure he was okay. But he actually managed the recovery. So I had met up with him this last time and caught up with him. The other interesting thing is that there are volcanoes in New Zealand, and it's an active volcanic area. The volcano that I could see from my window is only 400 years old. Yes, so people, there are reports about the volcano happening and drawings of it. So it's very recent. And of course, everyone knows about the geysers and the mud springs and that sort of thing. So a lot of geothermal activities. And then finally, tsunamis. Because of all this activity, tsunamis are a real issue. And so if we move to the next slide, and because I can't see the slides, I'll just have to describe that to you. So all along the coast, there are notices about tsunamis, and this affects, for instance, sewage pumping stations, which may be inundated. There was a very bad tropical cyclone, storms across the whole of New Zealand, and here's a photo of some of the road which was damaged, which meant they had to relay the water main that was in the road.
Jo, can I just pause you? We're not on the right slide. Can we go to the next slide for Jo? Because I think she's got it. That's the one. Thank you. So this is the one, Jo, when you can see the tsunami evacuation zone.
I don't know what has happened to my screen, but literally it's just a blank, and I don't want to log in and log out. And down the bottom is a repeat of that view from my window where you can just see a volcano on the horizon, and that is only 400 years old. So if we move to the next slide, which should be headed New Zealand culture, and these are my observations, and Gillian hasn't disagreed with me, but she may want to in her presentation. I would say there's quite a conservative attitude with a small c. And I will mention one thing that I just love. And in Auckland, and I don't know if this is general, and Gillian can tell me if it is, apart from in rush hour, everyone thanks the bus driver as they get off, including teenage boys at the weekend. I mean, so there are some aspects that maybe we might think are quite old-fashioned, but I think they're brilliant. There is still a strong British influence, but people are a lot of people moving in from the Far East, and so the British influence is diminishing. They love the outdoors. They're very entrepreneurial. People really like working for themselves. And so there's a lot of small businesses all across, Project Max, a small consultancy started by a couple of people experienced in the industry. My experience is they work hard, and they play hard. They all expect to leave at the normal time to go out, but when they're at work, they really focus and produce a lot. The Maori culture has quite a lot of impact, and things like a longer term view is more prevalent. People think about next generations. People this value nature and that sort of thing. As we were discussing before people joined, that generally people get up early and they go to bed early, and if you go into a lot of cities at 10 o'clock, you'd be surprised how quiet it is. But they often start work 8 o'clock, 7 o'clock, that's the usual sort of time. And Kiwis love their coffee. There are so many coffee shops. Which is brilliant. Really good coffee shops, independent coffee shops. And the other thing is that they love their locality. They are very wedded to the locality, perhaps because towns are a long way apart, and so they feel very attached to the local town, the local area. So going on to the New Zealand water industry, and the next slide, which I hope is headed the New Zealand water industry. This has never been restructured, privatized or anything like that. So it's provided by the local authority, apart from Auckland and Wellington. Auckland is one local authority owned company, Watercare, and then Wellington, the services are responsible to 6 local authorities, which is tough for them. So there are 67 different providers. Some authorities have, because they're small, the people managing water are also managing, say, road maintenance and parks and recreation and that sort of thing. And they introduced a new regulator in 2021, Te Mata Arawai, and they are responsible for regulating all aspects of water quality, so not just drinking water quality. So whilst I was there, if we move on to the next slide, which is headed reorganisation, there were plans to restructure the water industry. And it's really interesting because I am old enough to remember the restructuring of the water industry in the UK in 1974. And it's almost a carbon copy. 167 organisations restructured into 10. They'd sort of wondered about 4, but they'd landed on 10 eventually. But they had this election in October, and just like the election this time, water was quite a big deal. You can see, stop 3 waters. 3 waters is basically drinking water, wastewater, and rainwater. And so the new entities to manage water would manage all 3, and this wasn't popular. So the National Party campaigned against this, and they won the election. So all the plans that the Labour Party had been proposing all went awry. Oh, thank you. So if we move to the next slide, observations, I would say the nationalised industry in New Zealand is interesting to look at from the UK because they haven't avoided problems. For instance, whilst I was there, Queenstown was subject to a cryptosporidium outbreak, and the whole city, which is the main tourist centre in New Zealand, was subject to a boil water notice. And it did impact on the tourist industry. People were concerned about going there. So the clean image is not always justified. There are river water quality issues. Big sewer collapse whilst I was there in Auckland, which closed all the beaches. For anyone who sort of looks at it and think, oh, that's fabulous, there are some downsides. It's a very high cost of living, and that's a concern in New Zealand. Even locally sourced food is quite expensive. And I would say it's an awfully long way from absolutely anywhere else, which does make, for instance, importing goods for the water industry an issue. But if you fancy somewhere different, there are loads of jobs. They really need talented people out there. So those are my impressions. But if we go on to the final slide, which is, well, I thought it appropriate. It's a picture of Hobbiton, which you can visit. And there'll be a question and answer session after Gillian. So over to Gillian now, who will bring you up to date and talk a bit more about what's going on in the industry now.
Kia ora, everybody. Thank you, Jo. Lovely to be able to speak to everybody. When the introduction was happening, what you didn't hear was that I grew up in Derbyshire, so part of the East Midlands. So I probably know quite a few of the areas in which you are all living or working. So if we go to the next slide, please. So as Jo said, we had an election in October last year, and with it there was a change of philosophy. We had the National Party, which is, you know, sort of quasi the Conservatives, came in replacing the Labour Party. We are a coalition government, and so there's all sorts of negotiations that take place. But in relation to water, the decision was to do a further reform. And so when you saw the signs, the Stop Three Waters, the National Party in their election campaigns were proposing something called local water done well. And that's what we're in the process of seeing. And so what is happening, we're in a 3 legislative bill program. We had the first one that was passed in February, Valentine's Day, and that was basically to repeal everything that the previous government had done. We then had passed just a few days ago the local government water services preliminary arrangements, which ultimately said to the councils is that we want you, and if we go to the next slide, I'll continue. They basically said, we want you councils to be responsible for your water services, being drinking water, wastewater and stormwater. And we want you to ensure that you can be, that you've got enough revenue, that your investment is appropriate, that you're meeting all the regulatory quality standards, and that you have sufficient financing to be able to do that. And they have ultimately said, we don't want you just to tell us that you can do it. We want you to submit what are being called water service delivery plans, such that you can prove that you are. And at its heart, the reason that they want that to occur is that for decades across the country, we have had an underinvestment in water assets. And so for example, I think, you know, it's not been uncommon for the amount of, you know, in terms of depreciation, that they've been spent at a 70% rate rather than 100%. And so you can just imagine over a number of decades that the level of renewals that have occurred on pipes throughout the country have been inadequate. And so that we're seeing increasing levels of leakage. So from a drinking water perspective, we have about, say, 25% leaks across the country. But if you looked in Wellington at the moment, it's more like 45%. And that is because we haven't invested in our infrastructure. Also, there is the desire to make sure that councils are thinking about, say, their wastewater treatment plants. You know, are you complying with the environmental laws, the resource consents for those different plants, both from what you're discharging from those plants, but also in terms of the wet weather or dry weather wastewater overflows that might occur around the network. And so there are a number of it would be fair to say that that you know, we've had a lack of investment. We had work done over the last couple of years by the Water Industry Commission for Scotland, which basically was suggesting that we would need to spend between 120 and 185 billion dollars over the next 30 years. Now, those figures don't mean anything when you think about it in British pounds. So I think the best way for me to describe it is that WICS were effectively saying that we would need to, at a minimum, double how much we spend today every year for 30 years. That's what got you to the 120. And potentially 3.5 or 4 times what we currently spend each year to get to the 185. Now, as you can imagine, there are all sorts of people who have got different views as to whether those are good numbers or bad numbers, you know, as well as a question about whether we can afford either of those two numbers. But you can imagine that, you know, given I'm saying we've got to at least double what we are spending on water, that some councils, when you ask the question, are you going to be revenue sufficient? Are you going to be able to finance your investments? Are going to struggle to be able to do that. So there are 3 components basically to this water service delivery plans that councils have got. The revenue sufficiency, are you going to be able to collect enough from me and others in the community to pay each year? Are you going to be able to deliver sufficient investment from both from do you have enough people? Are you going to be able to, in the right timeframes, be able to do the levels of investment required, as well as are you going to be able to borrow enough money to be able to finance the investment in the assets? So if we go to the next slide, so those 3 concepts of that revenue, investment, and financing sufficiency are ultimately designed to require the councils to go, okay, can I do it on my own? Can I do this as an internal business unit or a division or division? Should I think about setting up a council-controlled water organisation that would have a professional board, would have a staff that are solely focused on water? Because as Jo said, a number of councils around the country, it's not uncommon for the smaller councils, which might be, you know, only have 30,000 people living within a district, just for them to be doing multiple types of jobs, you know, along with looking after water. So do you want to put all of your water assets in a separate organisation with that professional board, a management team that's purely focused on water, that's going to be there? There is also then the question of, would you be better off if you joined up with your neighbours? So we've got some economies of scale. And so that's when the box there, the multi-council controlled water organisation, is something that the councils are thinking about. So at the moment, there are a number of councils around the country who are having conversations with their neighbours and saying, do we want to join up? Now, you can imagine that there are all sorts of questions that would be coming to mind. You will have, in some regions, there will be meters. In other regions, there are not. So one of the problems that we've got in Wellington is that I don't have a water meter. And so there is no incentive for me to fix my leaking pipes, or even perhaps in some cases to know that I've got a leaking pipe. And so that question about how am I going to charge customers is certainly a live one. Are we going to see volumetric charging? But I think also one of the things that we're going to see if we end up with a multi-council controlled organisation is that you will have the different districts within that grouping going, I have invested in my water assets, I'm on top of them, my wastewater treatment plants are compliant, my leakage rates are below the national average, I'm doing okay. I don't want to join up with my next door neighbour who has not got as many compliant and well invested infrastructure. And so you can imagine that you start having conversations about how can I get to a postage stamp pricing, you know, so when you've got the same charge across a district. So there's going to be some tricky conversations that are going to come up, and you know, and a lot of those might be in relation to debt. Then there is a fourth option, which ultimately comes about by having a consumer trust water organisation, which again is a separate entity from the council, again with a professional board, but with some slightly different governance arrangements. And I guess one of the things that they're saying in terms of the fifth option is that you could have some combination of council-controlled organisations and consumer trust. In amongst all of that, we want to improve the planning and accountability frameworks so that we would expect or we would want these organisations to prepare statement of expectations so that you're having agreements about the level of service that you're targeting between the council and these new organisations, that we've got very clear water services strategies. You know, if you think about in some of our in our regions, they're quite you know, high population growth, and you can imagine if you're building new subdivisions, new sections that are for, you know, for multiple houses, that you need to make sure your water infrastructure is there, because there are so many opportunities for those greenfield investments. And you know, councils, as you can imagine, you know, in the UK as well as in New Zealand, you know, they want people to move into their district to bring increasing in regional GDP, and so you want to be able to see those sorts of things happen. How are we going to make sure that that council controlled organisation or that consumer trust is as aligned with where the local authority is going in terms of their investment? And you can imagine we would also want to make sure that we see the right sort of financial reports, that all the water is being ring-fenced, that all the revenue and the costs associated with water are being appropriately ring-fenced. And so one of the things that we would see is that even if you opted to keep within, have an internal business unit within your council, that you still need to be subject to these planning and accountability frameworks. You know, it's not a if I stay inside, I can avoid X, Y, and Z. It is a case of we want to make sure that you are ring fencing, because ultimately, when you haven't been spending enough money on your renewals, that money has been going somewhere. That money has been going perhaps on, you know, other infrastructure. It might have been going on libraries or on wastes or swimming pools or whatever it's gone on. It hasn't gone on the water side of things. And so what we're also going to see is that we will have an economic regulator, in this case, called the Commerce Commission. But if I think about the UK, we're essentially talking about a form of Ofwat, or a form of Water Industry Commission for Scotland. So if we go to the next slide, please. So Joe mentioned Te Mata Arawai, which is the Water Services Authority. It is around focusing on drinking water in particular. There's the you know, requirement for water services providers at the moment to have a duty of care in terms of that provision of drinking water, and you can, you know, the usual sorts of things in terms of water safety plans, source water risk management plans, and all of those sorts of things. And that's been one of the pieces that came about following the boil water notice that Joe referred to in Queenstown, when there was a cryptosporidium cases that were being discovered. It was there was a lot of focus on making sure that a multiple barrier approach is there for drinking water supplies across the country. The issue in Queenstown was that there wasn't a protozoa barrier, and that needed to be invested in. So ultimately, I've mentioned the fact that we're going to have a Commerce Commission, this economic regulator. We've got the drinking water regulator, who also has some oversight in terms of wastewater and stormwater, and we're going to see some new rules being written in terms of national wastewater standards. We've then got this third one, the regional councils, which is where the environmental rules and regulations come from. And I guess one of the things that I would see as I look forward, and there are a few other regulators, but these are the three main ones, is it's going to be absolutely vital that they work together. So if I think about the Commerce Commission, one of the ways in which our economic regulator regulates is by requiring information disclosure. Effectively, as they say, sunshine is the best form of disinfectant, and we are focusing on highlighting whether there is compliance with rules or not. But at the same time, Te Mata Arawai does a whole bunch of regulation and requires reporting on a network environmental performance measures. Those two organisations need to talk together. I mentioned the national wastewater standards that are going to be developed by Te Mata Arawai. That impacts what the regional councils are required to think about in terms of granting consents for wastewater treatment plants. They need to be talking together. They need to be enforcing it, because it's one thing for Te Mata Arawai to write the rules, but the regional council needs to make sure everybody's compliant. So if I think about some of the things that I've heard have occurred in the UK, whether it's in relation to Windermere or whether it's in relation to to beaches on the south coast, there is that need to make sure that the regulator is enforcing those rules and not just letting them be, wet bus tickets effectively. We've also got a range of things in terms of wanting to make sure that there are options from a drinking water perspective for acceptable solutions, which is an alternative way of meeting the rules. So we've got a number of, if you've got rainwater tanks, what are the rules that you need to be thinking about? And some of this might be in terms of, you can imagine if you've got, a population base of 2,000, which there will be for some of the small towns, and they've got a drinking water plant that suddenly has to have multiple barriers, is thinking about what's the affordability side of things for that, which means we're going to need the Te Mata Arawai to talk to the Commerce Commission. So there's all sorts of bits and pieces that are occurring there. And I think that was my last slide. Various links to all sorts of information that have been released in the last couple of weeks. If anybody wants to look at it, there's about 2 inches of paper. So there's lots to read. And I, from my perspective, very happy to take questions.
Brilliant. Thank you, Gillian, and thank you, Jo, for sharing that information with us. We do have a couple of questions in the chat box so far. We have a question which is, what is the meter penetration rate in New Zealand?
So if Auckland has got meters, and then a number of other districts around the country have, and it's probably about 50% of the population. I guess the important caveat there is that 20% of the population are not receiving drinking water through the reticulated network. They will be on private supplies, either their own supply or they will be small community supplies. And so that 50%, I would need to double check in terms of whether that's 50% of the reticulated population or 50% of the entire population. So we've got a way to go.
Yeah. I mean, there are two main cities that are metered, which is Auckland, which, as I said, is 1/4 of the population, and then Tauranga, which is a major port. But apart from that, it's just small localities.
You've got Christchurch is also metered, but it's only recently started to use them as the basis for charging, and so that's been one of the issues. So yeah, but you've got Central Otago district has got them, Kapiti's got them, New Plymouth has got them, and they've actually just put in and are having major savings in terms of their discovering vast numbers of leaks that are on the the household or the business side. And yeah, it's good. I'll see if I can find the figures that were quite dramatic.
Thank you. We have one here, which is, what are the primary sources for water in New Zealand? Rivers, aquifers, mountains?
So we've got, you know, it's a mix, but there's a lot that's groundwater. I think something like 70% is groundwater.
Okay, thank you. Phil, I can see you've got your hand up. Do you want to ask a question?
Yeah, thank you very much. Could you give me an idea if New Zealand are looking at any other countries' models for their infrastructure and that kind of thing? And do you feel that there is a strong feeling that the different authorities will collaborate within the health and safety and standards procedures? So to give you an example, in the UK, all the wastewater authorities usually get together and collaborate and set standards right across all the authorities. But if you look at Southern Ireland, for instance, that they are, just like New Zealand looks to be split up into local authorities, it's a much more difficult situation to be able to cover the whole of that infrastructure. Does that make sense, Gillian? Yeah.
Yep. So I think there's a couple of things I would say there. New Zealand has got a long way to go, I think, in terms of improving its health and safety record in all aspects of infrastructure, not just water. There is one of the things that Water New Zealand has, because we're this industry association, is that we have a number of special interest groups. So we have a water service managers group, and there is sharing of health and safety information and some, you know, the development of manuals across that. And in fact, you can go onto our website and you can find one of the health and safety manuals. So there is already the desire to come together and share knowledge, and that's there in terms of all sorts of things. I mean, Joe's involved in another project in terms of pressure sewers, you know, and we so we like to collaborate, we like to come together and to work on ways that we can improve things. But as I said, from a health and safety perspective, we can go a lot further. I think one of the other questions that really you might be asking is, do I think we're really going to see amalgamation and therefore changes of practices? And I think the way that I'm talking about it these days is I'm optimistic, because I think it's absolutely vital that we can try and achieve some of these economies of scale, and also improve capability and capacity in our workforce. We don't have rules at this point in terms of our wastewater treatment operators or our drinking water plant operators. You know, at the moment in New Zealand, if you want to be an electrician, you have to be a registered electrician. If you want to be a plumber, you have to be a registered plumber. We don't have the same arrangements in the water sector. You can come in, as one of my colleagues would say, you can come in off the street and you can operate a plant. Hopefully the person who's asking you to operate it is doing it, you're doing it under supervision. And there are courses that you can do, but we absolutely need to lift our capability of our workforce such that, you know, at one level, everybody gets to go home at the end of the day safe, and that you and I, if you're in New Zealand, drinking safe drinking water.
Yeah, I mean, if I can come in here and just say one concern I have, and Gillian may have some opinions here, having seen how Wellington operates or doesn't, the water organisation reports to 6 different councils. So to have any decisions made, basically all 6 councils have to agree. And that's been, in my view, one of the issues, that there have been, you know, for instance, plans to invest in smart meters and what have you. And that's all been delayed because of the problem of talking to 6 councils, 6 groups of people who are not experts, where you have to explain to them in non-technical terms why you want to invest money. And I'm just worried that that model may be replicated elsewhere, which has so many problems. And you've got people leaving Wellington Water just because they're so frustrated at not being able to do things.
I mean, I think,
Sorry, Gillian, it was just that there is a comment in there just relating to that, actually, on those comments saying, you know, building on Phil's remarks, are you concerned, having so many councils looking after water, there will be a lack of expertise or economies of scale?
Absolutely.
Very much so.
If I look at the electricity sector, which is where I spent 20 years working in New Zealand, from a distribution network perspective, there are 27. Now, clearly, well, last time I counted in the UK, there are 14 distribution businesses. And so we, by having a smaller number of providers, doesn't matter what sector it is, you have the opportunity to have a more capable workforce, because you can invest, you can have that career structure, you've got the funding such that you will be able to think about innovations and think about new ways of doing things. So I hope that if we fast forward 10 years, that we aren't having a conversation where we've got 60 providers of water services in New Zealand. I hope it's a darn sight lower number than that.
And maybe if I can come in here as well, in the UK, we also have a number of medium-sized consultancies where, WRC is a classic example, where actually a lot of the people have operational experience. They've worked in utilities, in water utilities. You have the big consultancies in New Zealand, the Stantec, WSP, GHD, but they're very much, large project suppliers, and the engineers and other professionals in those organizations rarely have operational experience, and there's this huge gap. So there aren't even other organizations who could come in and support these very small utilities where, people are having to manage highways, manage parks and everything else on top of the water. That is a big problem. And there's a lot, huge appetite to learn in the water industry in New Zealand, which I found fantastic. But there isn't the experience always to learn from, which is why I said, there's lots of opportunities out there.
Yep. There are, if you go on my website, you can see there is an industry vacancies page. So do always keep an eye out. I think one of the things that we have is, just thinking about the wastewater sector, I think we have something like 321 wastewater treatment plants. Now, I don't know how many wastewater treatment plants there are in the UK, but that's an awful lot of plants for a population of, not much more over 5 million. Now, some of that's because the way that things have developed is that you've got what you and I would consider a village. A village has got its own wastewater treatment plant, and you drive down the road, another 5-10 miles, and there's another wastewater treatment plant. And so that sort of small plant, you're not getting the economies of scale from that perspective. Now, as you can imagine, if some of those were built 40 years ago, that what you and I would expect in terms of treatment would be a darn sight different to what it was originally designed to be. And so I think one of the issues that we've got is around how do you take people with you in terms of what is an appropriate level of treatment for your wastewater. How do you manage the overflows? All of those sorts of things. I often say to people, if there's a problem with a wastewater treatment plant in the sense it's smelly, we all notice. because odour is obvious. But we're not as clear, unless it's truly obvious, of what happens when there is a failure somewhere in the discharge. And that's something that we need to be able to get on top of. And I think that's a global problem in practice.
Okay, thank you.
Sorry, thanks for that. That's just one of my concerns. Would be one of my concerns as a supplier. In other words, if you take the UK's water industry and let's say the WIMES specification, which is the water industry's mechanical and electrical specification, all the different authorities within the UK all come together and have one member on the WIMES committee that will then decide between themselves what is the right policy, but that policy will then be spread out across the whole of the UK's networks, if you understand what I'm saying. So from a supplier, something like that would be key.
Absolutely. And so, Phil, I think one of the things that under the previous government, there'd been a lot of work done on national engineering design standards. And it looked like when the repeal occurred in February that was being lost. But in the recent announcements that we've had in the last couple of weeks, it sounds as though this government has realised that the National Engineering Design Standards, which would replace something like 45 codes of practice, is an appropriate way of getting some economies of scale. And so what they are, I believe, now trying to do is to put in some of the legislative hooks such that councils or their council-controlled organisations are required to refer to them, because it doesn't make sense for a city that's like 5 minutes drive from another one to suddenly have a completely different set of codes of practice.
Absolutely.
I mean, one of the interesting thing I observed is that although the industry is in one way far more fragmented, 167 organisations, I feel there's much more willingness to collaborate and come together where people have the time, the knowledge and the capability to do so. And I will give a call out for Gillian's organisations. I think Water New Zealand is much more active in achieving this. So Water New Zealand has commissioned standards and guidance manuals. As an example, a guidance manual on water loss management. And I think because there is less of this comparative competition that Ofwat encourages, people are happy to learn from each other. And that's something maybe we lost. It's coming back in the UK, but New Zealand is a much better example of collaboration, I think.
Thank you, Jo. I mean, I think I look at my members, and when Emma read out at the beginning that we've increased membership by 50%, we literally, when I joined 4 years ago, we had 2,100 members. Now we've got over 3,300. And ultimately, they are people who have come together because they are interested in making a difference. We've got 12 special interest groups, drinking water quality, water efficiency and conservation action group, smart water infrastructure group. Also, every topic that you can imagine would be useful. People are coming together and are wanting to develop guidance and to be able to share their knowledge. And sometimes that's, consultants that are coming together and giving pro bono time. And that's manufacturers that are coming together and saying, right, this is what we need to be able to do, as well as the water service managers. And it's a real, having come from an electricity sector where it's well and truly competition, it is something that is, I have found, rewarding and impressive in terms of that collaboration.
Thank you. We just got a couple of more questions before we finish. That we'd like to get answered, if that's okay. We have a question from Roger, which is what is the distribution network leakage rate? Is it published?
So we've got some information that's published. So up until 2 years ago, Water New Zealand used to do a national performance review. And so that was a voluntary, effectively, information disclosure where we used to publish all sorts of things. And we would get, sometimes 40 out of the 67 councils would participate in that. With the creation of Taumata Arawai, they are now a regulated entity and are requiring the collection of some of this information. And so some of that information will be available in the network environmental performance report. And I can put, at the end of this, I can put into the chat links to various documents that you might be interested in. And so that will give the leakage rate. But it's roughly, on average, about 25% across the country. Lower in Auckland because they've had meters for a long time.
Okay, thank you. And we just have a question here from George, which we might have slightly touched on already. Is there a large focus on combined sewer overflows as there are here in the UK?
So we don't have as many combined sewers as you do in the UK. Auckland is in the middle of a mammoth project, though, to separate out the wastewater and the stormwater. And so if you ever were to Google the Central Interceptor Project, which had one of its is in the middle of a big tunnel boring exercise. I think it was a breakthrough last night. That is going to make a huge difference, particularly in Auckland. Well, I would say, irrespective of whether we've got combined sewers, we've got so much, just simple infiltration, into our networks that we are seeing. After major storm events, we're seeing overflows. And certainly if I look at, we've had, as Joe said, a number of cyclones in the last couple of years, which have had dramatic impacts. And just more intense rainfall is causing chaos.
Thank you. And I think there's just one question from myself on this. You mentioned opportunities for people in New Zealand. So if there is, engineers, etc., that are looking to move over to the likes of New Zealand, what would be their routes to looking at opportunities? I think you touched on vacancies on Water New Zealand's website. Is there any other advice on that side?
So I think it would depend on the type of opportunity. I mean, as Joe said, the Stantec's, the GHDs, the Oricons, the ACOMs, WSP are all operating here. And so if you're an engineer within one of those big organizations, look, absolutely, I'm sure I would, talk to your boss and see if there's an opportunity in New Zealand. I think in terms of, more broadly, it's keeping an eye on what's going on. And if you've got particular skills, check out our industry vacancies page. It changes. I don't know what's going to be there this week or what's going to be there next week, but there are lots of opportunities. I mean, I spoke to Veolia, who operate a number of plants across the country, and there'd been unfortunately some job losses in a particular part of the country, and I was saying, those mill workers, I bet they've got people there that might be of value to the water sector, and my conversation with their country manager was, she's got 4 supervisor roles on the Coromandel that she would take immediately, and so there are all sorts of opportunities, and sometimes it's just about shaking a tree and you might find them.
If I can come in here though and give a warning, if you're going to move, do it early rather than late. My husband and I looked at the possibility of moving out to New Zealand after the Christchurch earthquake. He's a building surveyor, I'm a utility engineer. Perfect, no problem getting jobs. But to get permanent residency once you turn 50, there is a premium that the New Zealand government charge that goes up as you get older. Now, I love New Zealand. It's a fabulous place. And because I am even older than then. When I looked at it then, it would have cost, I would have needed to lodge $2 million New Zealand dollars in New Zealand investments. Now it would be $7 million, £3.5 million I would have to invest in New Zealand to be able to move to New Zealand. So if anyone wonders why I'm not there now when I had such a fantastic time, that's why.
So I guess I should say I moved out here when I was 26.
Yeah.
And certainly there are advantages, and I haven't needed to look at the residency. I think I probably applied for my residency when I was about to hit 30, or I was probably 29. There were advantages about being under the age of 30. There were advantages depending on your number of years of work experience, number of what your academic qualifications were, and all those sorts of things. But I would say, one of the things when I got the job opportunity, it was a case of I didn't want to get to 60 and wonder if I should have gone. And certainly I'm a darn sight closer to 60 than I was when I made that decision. And and I'm very happy. There are lots of opportunities, and come and give it a whirl.
Brilliant, thank you. We don't have any more questions in the chat box. What I would say is if anybody does have any further questions or requires further information, if you do reach out to the Pipeline Industries Guild and we can help you. Thank you to Joe and Gillian for your time this morning and some great information and insights there into New Zealand. And we'll get all the information sent out to everybody who joined the call, the relevant presentations and links. And thank you for your time this morning. Take care.
Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a good day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Cheers all.